Welcome back. Well, over the last 3 years, one of the biggest processes that you've seen playing out has been the testimony before the Zondo Commission. Remember how you all saw it all of the details of the wrongdoing that happened during the state capture era. You may remember the testimony around people like Ace Makashule or Faith Mutambe, or how former President Jacob Zuma refused to finish his testimony and what happened after that. Then there were the findings about how so much money left our country and was essentially stolen. Essentially by the Guptas, who we know won't be extradited here. Well, the person who put all of the money together was Paul Holden from Shadow World Investigations, now published a book called Zondo At Your Fingertips. It's currently on his fingertips because he's in our studio. Paul, good afternoon to you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I remember all of your testimony, and you put it all together for the Commission. Why have you decided to write a book?
Well, first of all, I think the Zondo Commission is incredibly important, and I think there's a tendency, I think, to forget the importance of it because the news cycle just goes on and there's other crises that happen. So I thought that it would be a massive shame if the Zondo Commission's work got forgotten over time. And part of the problem is that the Zondo Commission's findings stretch over to 4,500, 5,000 pages. It's incredibly dense, it's very legalistic, it's quite forensic. And I worried that people wouldn't engage with the substance of it. So the idea behind Zondo At Your Fingertips is to take all of that overwhelming evidence and condense it in a way that average South Africans can read and understand and appreciate both the content of the Zondo Commission's finding around wrongdoing, but also its vision for how South Africa can move forward.
There's also a thing about packaging. I mean, the Zondo Commission findings are available on a PDF file near you. No one's ever going to read it because you probably need a legal degree. If you put it together in a book, you actually change. It's like making a really good movie out of a very complex book. The movie is the memory, and it's the movie that becomes important.
Well, that's the intention, hopefully. I think that the scale of the Zondo Commission's findings are pretty daunting for the average person. And actually, I have to find that even in writing this book, I found it a little bit overwhelming, the extent of the evidence they considered, the complexity of some of the legal arguments. And you often found, when I was writing it, for example, that there were findings in one report that actually shed light on stuff in another report that people hadn't made a link to. So in going through the material again, I was able to understand it more holistically and also present it in a way which I think will make it a lot easier for people to understand.
There's been a lot of criticism for the report, a lot of criticism for how the findings haven't been implemented. We'll come to that in a moment. I do want to take a moment and just consider this, that as far as I know, and I think this point has been made, but it's worth repeating, that this is an almost unique process. Nowhere in the world have you had an inquiry into what is essentially the conduct of the governing party being held and supported by that same political party.
I mean, it is actually astonishing. I don't think there's maybe one or two examples in the whole rest of the world where you've had a commission of inquiry of this level and this depth. And usually that happens, where it's happened in a place like Argentina, for example. It's a new incoming regime which is investigating the corruption of a previous regime. But there's a continuity here. There's the ANC here as a whole. And actually, as you can see, the Zondo Commission is incredibly damning of its findings about the ANC, but also about Cyril Ramaphosa himself. So it is a very remarkable thing that it was appointed in the first place, and that Justice Zondo took it so seriously, and he had so many investigators who took it so seriously, and really applied themselves to investigating and considering the material, which sadly is uncommon with a lot of commissions of inquiry, but it's really uncommon around the world.
There's another element to all of this, which is the transparency. And I think, one of the things that's happened in South Africa is, and I think it follows the right to freedom of expression. First, we got used to that. Then we demanded it. You can never take away someone's right to freedom of expression, despite the fact that I passionately disagree with so many. Following on from that, I think, has been the idea that it is your right to understand and to know what happens, to know who made decisions. And I wonder if the Zondo Commission, the way it's been so transparent, has actually played a role in that. We now demand that every court process is in the open. We now demand to see the witness testimony, even if the witness doesn't want you to see it, partly because of the Zondo Commission. We've become used to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an incredible experience. I can't think of anywhere else in the world where you've had incredibly senior politicians and officials being called to account, who've had to appear in public and answer questions and explain themselves. It almost never happens anywhere in the world. And I think it has, as you say, I think it's encouraged a culture of accountability, of transparency, of requiring that people show their work and defend themselves. But I think what also needs to be said is the Zondo Commission was very good at showing its own work. It was very clear in its report about identifying the evidence on which it based its own findings, and had an incredible task of cataloguing it, archiving it, all of which is available online. It's an absolute incredible resource for any researcher now and in the future to go online and look at all of this incredible documentation and all of this testimony that tells, real nitty-gritty inside story of what was happening behind closed doors. It is really unparalleled.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the numbers, because they're still frightening. I mean, it was billions upon billions of rand that left our country during the state capture era, and it must have been quite difficult to track it all down. And towards the end of the commission, you helped the commission put that together.
Yeah, I mean, state capture was a very aggressively pursued agenda, and it really got into so many parts of the state, into so many SOEs, and the looting was pretty incredible. I think we're still a bit shocked by the numbers. So just in pure numbers, the amount that left the country or was awarded in dodgy contracts was 57 billion rand. That's the amount of money the state spent on dodgy Gupta contracts. And of that, about 16 billion rand made its way to the Guptas, which is about $1 billion, which is really nothing to sniff at. That's a huge amount of money that left the country, which should have been spent on pretty much anything else. So it was a very demanding process, but also a very rewarding process, being able to track all those funds. And in so doing, identify all sorts of other things we didn't expect to identify, like the existence of these multiple criminal networks that were laundering money around the country and out of the country. So I think it was a very rewarding process.
I think for a lot of people, they want maybe two or three things. First, they want proper accountability for the Guptas. You also want proper accountability for other people against whom findings were made. So that's an example off the top of my head, Malusi Gigaba, for example. I mean, Malusi Gigaba seemed to be able to do no wrong at one point. Was a minister in so many different departments. Now I think his reputation, I mean, he will disagree with this, but I think his reputation is pretty much toast. A point I'm trying to get to is that the big weakness, of course, is what happened after the Zondo Commission and the lack of accountability for people against whom findings were made, some of whom are still in cabinet.
Sure. And I think it's incredible that you have somebody like Mosebenzi Zwane sitting in Parliament. I think that's utterly insane. I think there is something to be said about how we should maybe try to consider the Zondo Commission in isolation for a moment and recognize the quality of the work that was done. I think the quality of the work that was done isn't diminished by what happens next. I think that's important to bear in mind. But I agree. I think there has to be action on everything that's been identified. And what I think has flown under the radar a bit, which I think has been a bit unfortunate, is there has been a lot of asset forfeiture action happening. There have been a number of asset forfeiture cases where you've had big assets frozen or seized back, or you've had the SIU entering into complex arrangements with some of the multinationals involved. So there has been a degree of accountability there. And just to plug some of our work, a big part of what we're doing now at Shadowboard Investigations is taking these findings and making them internationally relevant. So a big part of what we're doing now is approaching law enforcement in other countries like Germany and Switzerland and saying your companies that are housed in your country were enabling and involved in state capture, and you must hold them accountable. And I've actually been quite surprised that in places like Germany they have taken it very seriously. So there has been probably more than people realize, but probably not enough to make people satisfied.
President Cyril Ramaphosa took quite a long time to give an official, formal response in Parliament. And the response was fascinating because it said quite a few things long-term, for example, about people who work for, say, the State Security Agency. So reform in the long term. Said nothing about some of the people in his own cabinet against whom findings were made. And that's surely a weakness.
It absolutely is. And I think the interesting thing was that the Zondo Commission was actually very clear about that weakness, because there were multiple times at which the Commission said, this person clearly isn't fit for public office, or this person is guilty of these things, why aren't you taking action against them? And Cyril Ramaphosa's response at the time was, well, I want to see what your final report says. And then there's actually a very interesting discussion where Justice Zondo says, well, my report's going to be taken on legal challenge, almost certainly. Are you going to wait for that 5 years to, of that process to conclude before you take action? There's definitely a gap between what the Commission recommended in terms of personnel and the ruling party and what's been implemented. And I think part of what I hope the book will do is keep our attention on that so that we can keep mobilizing around it.
The fact that we haven't taken action, the fact that some of the people still hold political power, I must say, of course, that, there'll be an election next year. And the Zondo Commission is going to, I think, along with load shedding, going to be sort of, sitting in the minds of some voters. Not all voters by any means, but some voters. Could state capture happen again because we haven't actually followed up on the recommendations?
I think it's always a risk. I think the institutional recommendations that the Commission made were very interesting. So things like directly electing a president, as one example, because we saw one of the great enablers of state capture was this concentration of power within the executive. Suddenly, we didn't realize when the Constitution was written, I think the Constitution was written with the idea that Mandela would always be in power or somebody like him. It was never written with the idea, or maybe there'd be a bad actor as a president. And a lot of that constitutional architecture remains undisturbed. And I think at that level, it is still worrying that you still have a mega powerful presidency that, appoints a chief justice, for example. That is a real conflict of interest, potentially, and that needs to be resolved. What I'm hoping is that the Zondo Commission, the idea behind accountability, the idea behind making sure people get prosecuted is to deter this happening. And I'm hoping, at the very least, that the Zondo Commission has shown, maybe for the first time in post-apartheid South African history, that if you are involved in wrongdoing, there will be some comeuppance. It may not be enough, it might not be satisfying, but there is some. You mentioned Malusi Gigaba. There is the point that his reputation is now effectively in tatters. So there is a cost to him for what he's done. And I think that has to be borne in mind going forward.
Paul Holden from Shadow World Investigations, thank you very much indeed. Glad you were able to make the time to come in.